What's up guys, Asian here again with another Elsewhere video, and today we're going to be discussing the Colossus Ultimate, the Frozen Colossus Ultimate, and the new debuff that it provides for players, which is Major Vulnerability. We'll be talking about basically how much damage we can expect to see from this new Major Vulnerability debuff that it's able to provide. So this is a completely new debuff. There has been no source of Major Vulnerability in the game as of this patch, so this is going to be completely new, so we're going to have to see basically how much it plays out here. So right here we have the Flesh Atronak ultimate here. So unleash a frostbitten Flesh Colossus to pulverize enemies in the area. The Colossus smashes the ground 3 times, dealing frost damage with each smash. Each smash applies major vulnerability to any hit for 3 seconds, increasing their damage taken by 30%. This is an instant cast time. You have to target it on the ground. It has a range of 28 meters. The radius of each smash is 8 meters, and the duration is 2 seconds. So each smash will apply a major vulnerability. So this will give us a total time of 5 seconds on major vulnerability, and it costs 150 ultimate. Now, the 2 morphs that you can pick, Pestilent Colossus and Glacial Colossus, do not affect the uptime major vulnerability, so it doesn't really matter which one we take a look at. So what we're really going to be focusing in on is this major vulnerability. So like I said, because each smash applies major vulnerability for 3 seconds, and the last smash I'm assuming happens on the last second there, we have a total uptime of 5 seconds on the smash. This is assuming that it basically hits as soon as it pops up, as soon as you activate it. So it might be a little bit different. It might be closer to 4 seconds, it might be closer to 5 seconds, but we're going to be going with the sort of optimistic approach, which is a total of 5 seconds uptime on that major vulnerability. We also got to take into consideration the fact that it is an ultimate. So we have to take into consideration that ultimate costs 150 ultimate. And then we do need to take into consideration any sort of additional ultimate generation passives that Necromancers have. So there is one ultimate generation passive here under the Necromancer skill line. Is down here, corpse consumption. So when using an ability on a corpse, generate 10 ultimate, and this can occur once every 16 seconds. So we're assuming that we're going to be able to do this every 16 seconds. Basically, we're going to be able to do this on cooldown in order to maximize ultimate generation here. Now, because you do need to use an ability on a corpse, and we're assuming that you're going to be running this on a tank, because we are going to be comparing this to Aggressive Warhorn. That's just something that you kind of take in mind. So a lot of these abilities that Necromancers have do require to use an ability on a corpse, but some of them might be a little bit tricky to use on a tank, but I guess we'll have to see how this all plays out on the testing environment. Now, moving over to R now, which is our trusty little statistical calculator here. So here, we up this line up here. Actually, let me go ahead and blow this up so you guys can see this a little bit better. But the first line is basically our theoretical max amount of ultimate generation. So we have the base ultimate generation, which is 3 ultimate per second. We have 0.66, which comes from Minor Heroism, which you should be getting from Heroic Slash. And then we have 10/16, which is from the Necromancer ultimate generation passive. So if we go ahead and use all that, we get an ultimate generation of 4.285 per second. Of course, in the actual game, you're not going to be able to really get 4.285 ultimate per second, but it will give us a good rough approximation or so. Now we have to figure out what is going to be the maximum uptime on Major Force and Major Vulnerability. So I just realized I do need to include ceiling on these portions here. So again, we're going with the optimistic estimation that we're going to have 5 seconds of Major Vulnerability uptime from this Flesh Colossus. The Major Force uptime from Aggressive Warhorn is 9.5 seconds. Now, in order to figure out the total uptime, we just need to figure out how much time does it take to basically between ultimate uses. So we basically take the ultimate cost and divide it by our ultimate generation. So 150 divided by 4.285 or 250 divided by 4.285. And we do need to use the ceiling function because obviously if it gives us a number like 35.5, 35 seconds will not give us enough ultimate. So we do have to ceiling that, so basically just raise it up to the highest number here. So it gives us a maximum uptime of about 13.89% for the major vulnerability and a theoretical max uptime of 16.1% on the major force from Aggressive Warhorn. Now, next thing we got to do is figure out how much damage do each of these provide for us. And the easiest way to do that is to just take a ratio. So so I'll write this down for you guys so you guys can kind of get a sense of the algebraic formulation behind this. To calculate out a percentage difference, you basically have your final value and your initial value. So the formula is final minus the initial value, and you take this entire quantity and divide it by initial. This will give you the percentage bonus. Now, if we go ahead and do a little bit of algebra here, this is equal to final over initial minus initial over initial. If you guys remember, I spelled initial wrong. If you guys remember from high school mathematics, when you have a whole number on top and you divide it by another whole number, you can just split it up. So let's say you have 2 plus 3 divided by 5. You can split it up into 2 over 5 plus 3 over 5. It's the exact same concept here. So we have final over initial minus initial over initial. Now obviously initial over initial are equal to each other, so this cancels out and this becomes 1. So now we're left with final over initial minus 1 will give us our percentage difference here, and that's basically what we have down here. So this first one up here is for major force. So we're interested in crit damage. So in these calculations, we're assuming that everything remains constant. Everything else in the damage equation remains constant. So the only thing that's changing is the fact that we're getting that major force. We're getting that 15% additional crit damage. So if we want to figure out what the average percentage increase is going to be from major force, we basically take our crit damage after we have Aggressive Warhorn, and take into consideration the average, and then we divide that by without the Warhorn. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So in this simple equation, we have our base crit damage, which is 50%, plus 10% from minor force, plus 10%. We're assuming we're on a Nightblade, so we're giving us a pretty good odds here. We have 20% from CP passives. We have the 15%, and then we do need to multiply this by the max uptime, which would be 16.1%. And then we have 19 from the Shadow Mundus. We're assuming that we're going with all divines here, and then we basically just take out this value here. So once we take out this value, which is equal to about 0.024, this will give us the percentage increase in DPS just from the major force from one Aggressive Warhorn. So we're not taking into consideration the fact that we might have 3 or 4 Warhorns going in a rotation. That'll give us about, got to subtract 1 here. This will give us a 2.2% increase in DPS from that one Warhorn. Now we do the exact same thing here with the vulnerability, major vulnerability. So we are assuming that we are getting minor vulnerability, so that's at 0.08%. And then again, we have to multiply this by the uptime, which is going to be 0.138. And then we just divide it by as if we don't have the major vulnerability. So if we do that, oh, and I forgot to add the -1 again. We get 3.8% increase in damage dealt from just using the Atronach here. So we can see here that if you are a support Necromancer, regardless of if you're a tank or a healer, or maybe even a DPS, because this does deal damage, it's going to be better for you to run the Atronach instead of Aggressive Warhorn. Now, this doesn't take into consideration the fact that Warhorn does also provide 10% additional stamina and magicka, so you do get a little bit of additional damage that way. We're just taking a look strictly at the major force compared to the major vulnerability. But just take a look at the absolute difference here. This is about a 1.6% difference in just raw absolute terms. But if you take a look at the relative difference here, let's do 0.0383 minus 0.0221 and divide by 0.0221. The relative difference is about a 73.3% increase in favor of the Atronach here in terms of relative increase in overall DPS. So if you're a support role, it does seem like there's no point in running Aggressive Warhorn anymore. Again, you do get the additional resources. You get more stamina, more magicka from running Warhorn, but I don't think it's going to make up that 73.3% difference there. Now, do I think this is overpowered? Now that you have the numbers, it's kind of up to you to make the decision. For me personally, I think this might be a little bit overtuned. So there are a few ways that I think they could address this so that the disparity is going to be a little bit closer. In my opinion, you still want to have major vulnerability be a good option to run. So you don't necessarily want to say, oh, you don't want to nerf it to the point where, oh, there's no point in running this. I don't think it'll ever come to that, but at the same time, you also don't want to make it so that this is the obvious choice to run if you're going to be a support Necromancer or even a DPS Necromancer. Like I said, this does have a stamina morph since it's an ultimate, so even a DPS could run this potentially. So you could possibly get both. You could get the major vulnerability from a DPS Necromancer, and you can get the major force from your tanks and healers just running Warhorn there. So there is that sort of combination there. Now, that there are basically two ways I can think of that they can basically change this and nerf it a little bit so there's a little bit less of a disparity here. The first one is to bring down the major vulnerability debuff amount. So it is a 30% increase to damage received right now. But if we take a look at Minor and Major Berserk is 8% increased damage done. Major Berserk is 25% increase in damage done. So if we change this to 25 instead of 0.3, we'll see that we do end up getting a lower value, 3.1. And if we decide to take a look at the absolute difference, it's a little bit less than 1%. If we take a look at the relative difference, that's only 44.3% increase. So this brings the disparity a little bit closer together if they just drop it down so it reflects the values that Minor Berserk takes. The other alternative would be, of course, to increase the cost of the ultimate. So instead of 150, let's say you bump it up to 200 instead. This gives us a max uptime of 10.6%. So if we change this number here, this gives us 2.94, so a little bit less than, just a hair less than what we would have if we change the major vulnerability from 30% damage received to 25% damage received. So both of these would still give you reason to run the Atronac because it's still going to be a larger increase to Warhorn, but the Warhorn resource increase, 10% additional stamina and magicka, might be able to close this gap a little bit more that way. So these would be probably the two ways that I would probably recommend trying to rebalance out this ultimate. Either reduce major vulnerability so it reflects Minor Berserk, which is sort of the sister buff, or increase the cost of the ultimate up to 200 rather than 150. So those would be my two personal recommendations. Of course, this isn't going to prevent groups from running, let's say, Necromancer DPS and having them run the Atronac instead of like having your tank or a healer run it. That way you can get the both worlds, the best of both worlds. You get the major vulnerability and you get the major force. But if you're just kind of looking at whether or not you want your supports to run Warhorn versus the Atronac, if you're a Necromancer tank or a Necromancer healer, then these two changes would probably be good. Now, if you combine these two changes, I think that'd be a little bit too much. So if we just drop this down to 25%, yeah, in that case, there's really no reason to run the Flesh Atronac as a support role because now you're only looking at a 0.2% difference, absolute difference, which is probably only 10% relative difference, I believe, if my mental math is correct. Let me just double check this real quick. Yeah, it's only about a 10% difference or so, in which case that 10% additional resources from Warhorn would be more beneficial. So I would not do both. I would not increase the cost of ultimate and drop the value of major vulnerability. I'd do one or the other. That way you still have a compelling choice to run Warhorn as a support role compared to running the Atronac as a support role instead. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Flesh Atronac, the major vulnerability debuff that's going down here. So that is going to be it for this video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. I'm looking forward to trying this out on the PTS. Of course, these are all mathematics, these are all numbers, these are all theoretical values here. So the only thing that we're going to be able to really see is going to be when I actually are able to go onto the PTS and do actual tests to see whether or not the DPS increase from running the Atronac is actually greater than the DPS increase from running Warhorn on a support role. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.